Hello, and welcome back to my channel. I'm Sweetbats, and I'll be turning this Toralei doll from Monster High into Retzko from Aggretsuko. If you haven't watched this on Netflix yet, I'd highly recommend it. It's a very cute show and oftentimes relatable. I actually just finished season 3 this week. Very late to the party, but I'm finally caught up. There's a lot to do on this doll. I learned from my Waffles doll that it's best to reroot when animal ears are involved. Her ears will need to be patched and bulked up. I'll need to take her stripes off and make her a tail, since this second-hand doll was received without one. Let's get started! First off, I remove her head, but get an issue I've never encountered before, where part of the vinyl in the head is stuck around the neck peg. Carefully, I use an X-Acto knife to slice the head free. Then I can start cleaning up the head by cutting the hair, taking care when working around the cat ears. Next is using pliers to scrape the remaining hair out from through the neck, making sure to be careful at the hairline.
I split the pie!
Pull out the bits using pliers, forceps, or tweezers. Once the head is empty, I can continue cleaning by wiping up the paint and glue with acetone nail polish remover. I wash the head with warm, soapy water, then use liquid fusion to try and repair the scalp, wrapping it in rubber bands to hold it in place and leaving that to dry overnight. Next is building up the ears, since Retzko has much larger ears than Toralei, and I do this with epoxy sculpt. The directions state to wear gloves while working with this, but it kept sticking to my gloves, so I eventually ditched them, and it was much easier afterward. Just be sure to find gloves that play well with epoxy if you do this yourself. Use sculpting tools and water to get the shape just right and blend it into the head seamlessly. I sculpt the tail with the remainder and stick it into the back of the doll to try to get the fit just right. I let all of this cure for 24 hours, then sand down the ears and paint them. Now for the hair. I chose Heartland's acrylic yarn in Bryce Canyon, separating the 4 twisted pieces of yarn, then painted the scalp a matching color. While I wait for it to dry, I glue brushed out white yarn to the ears, but later replace it with longer pieces, since the hair buried it in the end. Once the scalp is dried, I can begin rerooting. I once again root every hole with yarn, which makes the hair extremely fluffy and honestly adds way too much. Regardless, I pour in glue through the neck hole, let it sit overnight, then brush it out with a pet brush and flea comb and straighten it on low heat before pinning it all back and sealing the face with 2 layers of Mr. Super Clear. And now to skip forward 2 years. Retzko got put on the back burner since August 2019, as I had other customs to prioritize, as well as life just being hectic on top of the pandemic occurring. I also moved and got a video camera dedicated for my crafting, so if there was a noticeable change in quality just now, it's because I'm not filming on my phone anymore. Yay for upgrades! I draw Retzko's eyes, going a bit lower than the mold so I can use the molded line as an eye crease, taking my time and erasing as needed to get everything just right. Once I'm certain I like it, I use darker colors over my existing lines and add in pupils. I'd recommend not adding these to the first layer until you're 100% certain you don't want to change anything, since these are much harder to adjust or remove. The last thing I do before sealing is add pastels to her lips in a mix of vermilion and a bit of hot pink, which I thought suited her skin color nicely but wasn't too bold, definitely something that could be worn in the office. Starting on the next layer, I add pastels to the eyes to soften the iris a bit and give it a more uniform color coverage. These actually might be some of my favorite eyes I've done. The rest of layer 2 is basically just building up existing colors and adding details like eyebrow hairs and some contouring and blush. seal that in and build up colors on layer 3. Look how bright the white is showing up now. I worked on this face for about 2 hours before I remembered that my initial vision was to make her more wide-eyed and cute rather than the almost seductive look I gave her here.
I screwed up the face because I procrastinated for 2 years!
I didn't want to start completely over and lose more motivation, so I dipped a Q-tip in acetone and carefully tried pulling off only the eyes. Not one to waste an otherwise perfectly good layer, I added black to her nose. I eventually decided it was best to redo the blush entirely instead of trying to match the part on the other side of the harsh acetone line, and carefully wiped that as well. Once I washed the acetone off and sealed the face, I can do the eyes the way I should have initially done. I start with pastels for the eyeshadow, contour, and blush, then can add the pencil lines on top of those. This time, I work more with the mold of the eye, but make the outer corner a tad bit more rounded rather than following the shape all the way around. Despite being one of my least favorite parts of a face-up, I was super happy with how the eyebrows turned out, and I'm very glad I didn't have to wipe those off and do them again. For her muzzle, I started adding some white pastels, erasing it from the lips and nose before building those colors back up. On to layer 4. I keep building up colors on this layer and add highlight to the eyes. Layer 5 had more color buildup, along with 6, which is when I finally added the brown bits on the muzzle. I also added white lines around the eyelashes. I loved the way it looked on my last doll. Once I'm happy, I seal everything in. For layer 7, I realized that the pastel muzzle wasn't really cutting it. Each layer of sealant dulls the pastels of the muzzle, so it's definitely a Sisyphus situation where I'm really not making much progress, no matter how many layers I put down. I tried painting the muzzle, but I really didn't like how it looked. I wiped the paint off and pulled out the airbrush in order to get streak-free color, but some paint got where it shouldn't. I tried using some non-acetone remover to pull the color off, but... yeah, I basically removed an entire eye. I rebuild the colors that I can over the airbrush paint, and I was surprised at how well the pastels went on. I even lay some colors down on the non-sealed area of the eye, then properly seal it and redo the eye that I destroyed. Layer 8 went surprisingly well. I started off by going over the face with some Pearl X powder, which helped mask the few white flecks of airbrush paint that remained on the forehead. Since I'm building up color still, I don't bother removing the micro pearl from areas like the eyes. It looks like a lot at first, but the MSC will tone it down to a lovely shimmer. Miraculously, I managed to almost completely rebuild the eye in this layer. Off camera, I did a 9th layer, but it was just color building with no further additions, so I didn't bother filming it. On layer 10, I go over the nose and lashes with black gouache paint and a tiny brush to brighten them up and add a bit more dimension. I also use white gouache for the scleras. Whenever some gets into the iris, I can just use water to pull the color off. The same gouache is also used for catch lights in the eyes and to brighten the eyelash lines since they dulled a good amount from all the sealant. I feel that they're a little too bold for my liking now, but I don't entirely hate it on Retzko. It adds a bit of a cartoony pop to the face, which I'll probably try to avoid for most other face-ups, but I feel it's not horrible here. Tamiya gloss is used for the final layer, and I add it to the eyes, nose, and lips. Once it dries after about an hour, I add a second layer, and with that the face is done. I work on the body next, using sandpaper to remove the stripes. Afterward, I use a buffing block to restore some of the shine to the plastic. I add a couple layers of pastels to blush the body, then apply Mr. Super Clear Gloss. I like using this on the bodies, with the matte being used for the faces. The head gets reattached, at which point I realize how heavy the head is. I also cut the neck peg to pop the head back on easier, but I cut a little lower than I should have. If you do this yourself, cut above the prongs but trim them down a bit. Once I pull out the pins holding the hair cloth, I can begin cutting and styling the hair. The pins got stuck and were a little tricky to wiggle out, and I have to brush out the sealant and re-straighten the hair because it's been pinned up for 2 years.
This is what I get for procrastinating!
I really need to get a smaller straightener for dolls. This one is so unwieldy. If you have any suggestions for smaller straighteners with temperature control, or ones that are fixed at a low heat that won't burn the yarn, please let me know. I eventually tried a DIY hot comb by heating up my flea comb against the straightener and using the hot metal to comb through the hair and help certain areas lay flatter. I actually had a really hard time getting her hair the way I wanted. I was going for a curled under bob type style, but probably due to having rooted too much, it was very thick and didn't want to curl well. I tried heating up a crochet hook, and I tried wrapping the hair around straws and using hairspray to keep it in place, but nothing held, and I had to brush it out and start over. Eventually, I used some thinning shears to remove a lot of the unnecessary bulk, then curled the hair under section by section with the crochet hook to get a basic shape, then made it stick with hairspray. It wasn't the look I envisioned, but was as close as I was gonna get. For the tail, I make some brown and orangish wefts, mixing orange and yellow to try and get a shade closer to the doll's body, then glue them to the tail I made earlier. I already painted it to match the body just in case any of it showed through the wefts. Off camera, I make her standard office outfit, using patterns from DG Requiem once more. And with that, Retsuko is finished. Wait, something's missing. She's a Sanrio character, but she seems a little too cute. She just needs a little...
Rage!
Of course, it wouldn't be aggressive Retsuko without the aggressive part. The finishing touch of this doll is going to be her trademark rage face. Desk change for the throwback to when her face was blank. I grab a mask from one of the inner monster dolls, fit it to the face, and mark where the hairline is so I can cut it to fit properly. Back to the present, I try to use non-acetone nail polish remover to get rid of the paint without melting the plastic, but it really wasn't working. I eventually took it to the bathroom sink to rinse it while I used acetone.
Stop using acetone on plastic!
Yeah, unsurprisingly, it melted. It looks pretty messed up now, so I try to smooth out some of the melted bits with sandpaper. I use a rotary tool to cut the lines I marked and sand down the rough edges, then fit to the face and adjust as needed, repeating until I end up with this. At this point, I realize the color really doesn't match, and I paint over the mask with my best attempt at color matching.
Why didn't I do this in the first place?
It's not ideal, but I'm hoping that after the face is done, the color difference won't be as noticeable. I airbrushed the muzzle white, and despite telling myself to do thin layers, my urge to cover up everything in one go prevailed, and I ended up spraying too much paint on it, so it really didn't look nice and smooth like if I had done it properly.
Learn how to use an airbrush!
I start by brushing on the brown markings with pastel. Now time for her heavy metal eyes. I actually didn't know how many variations of her screaming face there were until I started looking up references. I ended up choosing the first one. I really liked how it looked. For some reason, I went into it with a black pencil instead of sketching it out with a lighter color. So instead of swapping out the pencil as soon as I realize it, I instead take my time and hope I don't mess up. Once both eyes are done, I add an animal nose to the mask to match the face below. more cartoony brows, since my goal is for the mask to look like the official design, while the vinyl head is Retzko in my style. I filled these in with a white chalk pastel, which had a really nice color payoff. After sealing and brightening up the colors on layer 2, I add some Fimo air dry clay to her muzzle to make a smooth base for her screaming mouth, then smooth it out with water and sand down the edges. I really should have added this early on, before airbrushing, so it would have looked much nicer.
Make a plan before jumping into projects!
To try and tidy it, I use watered down acrylic paint on the muzzle to even out the color, since the clay is a bit gray. Then it's time to sculpt the screaming mouth. I roll small tubes of air dry clay to get the outer shape of the mouth right, then press them onto the muzzle and tidy the edges. Another tube is rolled, this one with the pointed end, and I cut several of these points off to make tiny little teeth. Of course, this is more clay than needed for a few teeth, so the remainder is used for her tongue. Once I get the shape right and add details, I drape it over a tool in order to keep this position. After it's dried, I use a rotary tool to cut off the excess and sand it until it fits the curve of the mouth properly. The mouth is dried by this point, so I paint the lips and the inside of the mouth with black acrylic paint and let everything dry. I do touch-ups on the second layer with white acrylic, covering any of the black that made outside of the mouth. It looks pretty weird right now, but trust the process. I sand down some of the teeth to make them shorter and ensure they have more of a flat edge to lay in the mouth, and arrange them how I want. Once I'm happy with placement, I use glue to set them in place. Off camera, I painted the tongue, but that's glued in at this point too. Looking fierce! I was absolutely putting off the tiny forehead kanji, but I can't any longer. I referenced several images from the show and looked at the kanji itself, but I didn't trust myself to get it right, especially with how the stylized fonts make it difficult for someone unfamiliar with Japanese to tell where a stroke is coming from. I found a site that supposedly gave proper stroke orders, but when I checked with a Japanese-speaking friend, they made several corrections to what I had done. Once my revisions were approved and I had it centered how I wanted on the face, I went over it with a freshly sharpened black watercolor pencil. I add a layer of Pearl-Ex powder to the mask, but I really don't want this as sparkly as the face, so I limit myself. I then build up some colors and give the mask a final layer of sealant. For the finishing touch, I glue some white fabric behind the eyes, keeping with the character design, and add 2 layers of gloss to the nose, teeth, and tongue. And with that, I can call Retzko completed. Thank you so much for checking out this video. Your support means the world to me. If you're interested in seeing work in progress shots, getting early access to my videos, or just supporting me in general, I have opened a Patreon on a pay-what-you-want basis. I'd like to thank my current patrons, and a huge thank you and shout out to my friend David at Scream Academy, who loaned his impressive vocals to this video. If you're interested in seeing more of my work, please check out the rest of my channel or my Instagram at sweetbatsOOAK, where I post all of my finished content. I hope you all stick around for my next video, and if you want to know when it's coming out,
Subscribe!
thanks again, and I'll see you next time. Take care.